want? Justice! Where? Now! What do we want? Justice! Where? Now! What do we want? Justice! Where? Now! Do we want? Justice! Where? Now! What do we want? Justice! Where? Now! What do we want? Justice! Where? Now! Do we want? Justice! Where? Now! What do we want? Justice! Where? Now! What do we want? Justice! Where? Now! Do we want? Justice! Where? Now! What do we want? Justice! Where? Now! What do we want? Justice! Where? Now! Do we want? Justice! Where? Now! What do we want? Justice! Where? Now! What do we want? Justice! Where? Now!
Welcome. This evening, ClassACT is honored to present Racism and the Criminal System, Communities Fight for Justice, a presentation of our Justice and Civic Engagement Initiative. I'm MARION, co-chair with Jonathan Sprague of ClassACT HR 73. It is now my great pleasure to introduce my classmate and friend, award-winning journalist, Sylvester Monroe. And he has served as an assistant foreign editor at the Washington Post in charge of reporting for Europe and South Asia. He has also held posts with Newsweek, Time, the San Jose Mercury News, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and Ebony. And he's currently working on a book about the Black men in Harvard's 1973 graduating class. Sylvester, welcome.
Thank you, Marion. I'm really excited about today. We have assembled a stellar panel to talk about racial inequality in policing, our courts, and the criminal justice system. I will start, I will introduce them now. On the panel are Gina Clayton-Johnson, the Executive Director and founder of the SE Justice Group, an organization that advocates for people for incarcerated people and the families of the incarcerated. She's also been a defense attorney. We also have Rick Jones, Executive Director and a founding member of Neighborhood Defender Services, also a former defense attorney. CHRISTY LOPEZ is a Georgetown Law School professor and head of their co-director of its innovative policing program. She was also a deputy chief in the special litigation services of the Civil Rights Division at the U.S. Department of Justice, an organization that investigated police departments across the country for best practices and police abuse complaints, etc. And finally, we have Jason Williams, the newly minted district attorney of the parish of New Orleans, also a former defense attorney. And I'm really thrilled to have you guys here, and thank you all for joining us. The first question I'd like to ask is to start out by saying, you know, many people say that the criminal justice system is broken and needs to be fixed. But there's another group that suggests that it's not broken at all, that in fact, it works exactly the way it was intended to work. It was designed to keep Black and brown people in check. The thin blue line that we often talk about, that thin blue line was to protect white communities and others from Black people who are deemed to be more criminal, more devious, more dangerous than other members of society. What I'd like to ask each of you at the beginning, and we'll start with the district attorney, Mr. Williams, since you represent perhaps more than any of us right now, the criminal system that we're talking about, to ask you to respond to that view, that the system is not broken and that it works exactly the way it is, and talk from your perspective as a district attorney about how that impacts your work. Mr. Williams?
Thank you, Mr. Monroe. If any of us go to our cars right now and crank the engine turns over, put it in drive, press the gas, and it moves forward, that car would be operating exactly as it was designed to operate. The criminal legal system is working exactly as it was designed to operate. In fact, in my office, we intentionally have stopped using the phrase criminal justice system because there is very little justice for so many people in this system. History, numerous studies clearly show disproportionate impacts on minorities. And it's not just for Black and brown people, it's for any other. It's sexist, it's racist, it's xenophobic, and that is 100% by design. In fact, when the criminal legal system was designed, the only people that were voting, the only people who were weighing in were white men. And it was absolutely designed to do what it does, which is to protect and serve one group and over police and over prosecute another. People were up in arms, and rightfully so, this summer at the death of George Floyd. But truth of the matter is, we should have been up in arms with the fact and the idea that 2 police cars and 3 police officers are arriving at a store because possibly a bad $20 bill might have been passed. That simply would not have happened at Neiman Marcus or Saks Fifth Avenue, which really amplifies the dual purposes of our system. As district attorney, I believe it is my job to increase safety and deliver justice. And there are a number of folks who believe that the district attorney's office does not work for them. So one of the things that my office has been working really hard at is building community trust and breaching those and building bridges where that trust has been breached. And one of those things is having a civil rights unit looking at police or prosecutorial misconduct in the past, looking at wrongful convictions, looking at excessive sentences. And we began a little while ago with the undoing of Jim Crow juries. In the city of New Orleans, in the state of Louisiana, you only need 10 out of 12 folks up until a couple of years ago to convict. And that law was passed at an 1898 Constitutional Convention which had a self-professed goal of maintaining white supremacy and limiting those 2 marginalized voices that might vote for not guilty. And so we are not just looking forward, but we're also looking backwards so that we can start to convince the public, the media, all neighborhoods, that a prosecutor's office actually works for every single neighborhood here in Orleans Parish.
Thank you. Rick, I'd like you to respond to the same sort of premise that the system is not broken from the perspective of a longtime defense attorney.
Well, thank you, Sylvester, for the question, and to all of you all for the opportunity to spend this evening with you guys. I'm looking forward to a very good and robust conversation. When I saw this question, it made me sort of think of 2 things, sort of competing lenses through which to sort of view our legal system. And certainly it's a very easy argument to make, and not an incorrect one, I don't think, that when you look at it from an intentionality perspective, it's easy to see that whether you and I won't go too deeply into the history because I know there are folks on this panel who are much better at that than I am. But when you look at sort of the original sin of slavery in this country, when you think about the origins of policing, when you think about the slave codes and slave patrols, and then curfews and vagrancies for slaves and for Black folks, and you move through convict leasing to Jim Crow to the war on drugs to stop and frisk. I mean, at every sort of stop along the way, you can see that the system was designed and remarkably adept at keeping Black and brown folks and others out of subjugated, oppressed, out of the economic mainstream, out of the social mainstream, and really keeping them sort of on lockdown for the past 400 years. So there's a real through line and a real easy argument to make about intentionality. But I also think that there's a number of folks, and this is just from being around and doing panels like this and being engaged in conversation. There's a whole lot of folk that don't accept the intentionality argument, and so for those folks who sort of resist that, I always sort of suggested they should spend a morning in Lower Manhattan and sit for an hour in the arraignment part in the criminal courts building and watch an endless sort of stream of Black and brown, mostly young men in handcuffs being paraded through the system. And then after you've been there and you've done that, walk out of the front door of the criminal courts building and walk maybe 100 yards across the street to the family courthouse and sit in the courtroom, pick one, sit in any courtroom there, and again, watch as Black and brown children are taken from their families, from their mothers, from their fathers, from their grandparents, from their loved ones. But then after you've seen kids ripped from their families and put into the social services system, then you should just go right out the side door into housing court, sit in housing court for an hour and watch as Black and brown families, most of them, many of them without counsel, are rendered homeless and evicted from their places where they have raised generations of their family. And you can, in a morning in Lower Manhattan, you can go from criminal court to family court to housing court and really watch the sort of disintegration and the destruction of Black and brown families. And what that will lead you to, Sylvester, is one of two things. It will either lead you to believe that there are no white people who live in Manhattan, or that the ones that do are incredibly well behaved, or it will lead you to believe that Black folks in Manhattan are just inherently sort of bad. And both of those are wrong and invalid conclusions. And so if you don't subscribe to the intentionality argument, you are nonetheless left at the end result of either white folks are good and Black folks are bad, or our system is horribly broken. And since we know that Black folks are not bad inherently, and since we know that all white folks are not good inherently, it leaves us at the same place ultimately, that the system is horribly broken and it is horribly racist and it has to be changed. And so whether it's an intentionality argument and it's doing what it's supposed to be doing and it's doing it remarkably well, it probably is the best system for subjugation that we have found, and it is adept and it changes and evolves, or it is horribly racist and broken. But at either conclusion, we have an illness and we have to fix it.
Thank you. Gina Clayton-Johnson, as someone who works with people who are actually victimized in this system, I'd love to hear your reaction to this premise that, this is a system that works exactly as it was designed to work.
Absolutely. It is a pleasure to be having this conversation with you all, and particularly with my former boss, Rick Jones. It's hard act to follow to go right after you, sir, but what an honor to be in the same space again. I don't have much to add to what was already said. I mean, I 100% agree with the statements that have already been made about the system not being broken, but operating exactly as it was designed. I think one thing that I would say is that, we can go back to, kind of the early beginnings of our criminal legal system in useful ways to draw comparisons and to really understand the racist and white supremacist origins of that system. But I think it's also useful for us to understand that the uptick and the fueling of mass incarceration, the boom of kind of policing and our carceral infrastructure happened over a pretty short period of time, right? 40 years approximately, from the 1970s until 2000s, we saw a nearly 500% increase of people incarcerated in prisons and jails in this country. And who those people were, I mean, all I have to do, I myself, was struck, and I don't know that I should have been, but I don't think that you can be anything but struck when you walk into a prison visiting room and you sit with families. And in my particular case, I was in my first year of law school when someone that I love was sentenced to 20 years in prison. And so I had both the experience of visiting as a family member and also visiting as an attorney. And every single one of those times, all you see are Black and brown people, Black and brown families. And you know immediately, right, that the system cleaves across racial lines. Any person who has a moral compass and ethos around equality begins to ask themselves, what is up with this? And I think that, to be a student of the question, the moral question of the why, is to study and to understand everything that, DA Williams, excuse me, sir, and Rick earlier stated is accurate. Also, though, it takes us back to the 1970s when Nixon, and this is well documented, his administration declared that we would have a war on drugs, right? That's kind of when it started. And then of course there was a doubling down by administrations from both parties that followed at local and federal and state levels. And what we know is that war on drugs started with an object to do two things. One, to marginalize a political left, and number two, to control and to disempower Black communities. And that is very clear. That is like on the record quotes from high level officials. John Ehrlichman, others have said that this was the point of the war on drugs, and boy, has it been successful. And so I am absolutely of the school of thought that this is that our system of incarceration, our kind of addiction to punitivity, to quote, solve problems, solve for crime, all of those things has really been this outgrowth of a white supremacist agenda that we have to link arms and be committed to ending.
Thank you, Gina. I'd like to move now to Christy Lopez, and I'm really interested in your perspective as someone who has not only practiced this, both in the government, in the Justice Department, and as an attorney yourself, but also as a teacher right now. I mean, as a teacher, how do you, first of all, how do you respond to that premise that the system is not broken and working exactly the way it was designed? But as a teacher, every day, how do you deal with these inequalities?
I couldn't have asked for a better setup or a better lead-in from Ms. Clayton Johnson, and I really want to thank everyone for having me here tonight. So yeah, I did start out doing this work as a reformer, trying to fix broken police departments. I was at the Department of Justice. They were violating people's rights on a regular basis, and over the years, I began to realize this was not actually fixable in the way that we were doing it. Not that I think that's a bad process. People's rights are violated, they should be vindicated, but we're not going to fix policing because it's not broken, right? It's part of this larger system. And as Ms. Clayton Johnson was saying, yeah, this happened in 1970 up till now. And that's because before that, we had Jim Crow laws that could control Black and brown people. And before that, we had slavery that could control Black and brown people, right? And so now we need something else to control Black and brown people. And by the way, let's control immigrants while we're at it, right? And so what a nice thing that mass incarceration helped us to do. And policing has really just been a tool of that to a very large extent. And there's some offshoots and manifestations of that. For me, one of the revelations of my work at DOJ was in Ferguson, where it was very obvious that the system was not broke. They were policing to raise revenue, and they were doing a very good job at that. They were not policing to protect the public. So it didn't matter that they weren't really protecting the public. They were policing to raise revenue, and that was working just well. That car was driving, as DA Williams might say, and it was well run and well maintained. So that's sort of how I came to this. But I want to answer your question about what I do with this information as a professor, and also give you a couple of examples, which is one of the things I do as a professor, is give people examples for how this is actually playing out today. And actually just today in my criminal legal system class, which I try not to call criminal justice anymore, one of the students was asking me, well, how can you explain, Professor, why this case of the stop and frisk case of Terry in 1967 has evolved to be so different today? What's to account for that difference? How am I supposed to understand that? And I said to him, well, you could become a critical race scholar. And I sort of laughed, and the class sort of laughed, but I really didn't know what else to say to him. I said, I'm not sure there is another explanation. So part of what I do as a professor is try to instill in the future judges, the future legislators, the future prosecutors, what's actually happening in these cases, right? What's actually happening with our system. And one of the cases that I teach them is a case called Atwater, in which the Supreme Court held that a police officer could arrest someone and send them to jail for an offense, in that case, a seatbelt violation, even though a magistrate or a judge could not sentence that person to jail for that violation. That violation is punishable by a $50 fine. And in Atwater herself, Gail Atwater was a young white mother with 2 children, a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old. And the court talks in the opinion how it realized that the application of the law in this case is absurd, is unreasonable, it's terrible. But we have to think about all the other cases that we need police to be able to have this discretion in. In other words, we're sorry, white mother, that you have to get caught up in this system that's actually meant for poor Black and brown people, but you just got caught up in it. So you have to live by the rules that it's actually for a system that's built for everybody else. So that's one way that the system works, and why it's not actually a defense to say, well, wait, there are white people in prison too. That is, first of all, poverty is part of the system working as it will, controlling poverty and people who are poor. But more deeply than that, it really is a system that was designed with Black and brown people in mind, and with an irrational fear of Black and brown people, and a belief that Black and brown people respond differently to different stimuli, and you can't meet their needs through housing, education, jobs. They need to be kept in control. And another sort of an example of that is something I'm working on a lot right now as the co-chair of the DC Police Reform Commission. One of the issues we're going to be making recommendations on is taking police out of schools. And one of the biggest pieces of pushback you get to that is, some of these students really like their SROs, their school resource officers. They're a trusted adult in their life. They really, they can go to them with their problems. And to me, that just underscores how much we've normalized this. Every child should have a trusted adult. And if the school system can provide that, absolutely. But that person doesn't need to have a gun and handcuffs and the power to arrest you. How have we normalized it that we're going to keep police in schools because children need trusted adults, right? That's a system that was designed to control people, not to actually help children and help them be healthy adults.
Thank you. So which brings me to my next question, which is, why this could, if we all agree, if we agree that, this is intentional and it continues, why it's allowed to continue? And I would say that one of the reasons it continues is that beyond, when we talk about reform, beyond changing rules and regulations and new laws and whatnot, that what we're actually dealing, and what makes reform so difficult, is that we're dealing with people in the system, police officers, judges, prosecutors, who actually believe that Black people, and I think some of you have hinted upon this and touched upon this, that Black people and brown people are more dangerous, more deviant, more inclined to be criminal than others. I mean, you've heard, if not in real life, and I've heard it in real life, on television, you've heard police officers or prosecutors who've made mistakes and arrested somebody wrongly, sent them to jail, and they would say, well, yeah, I'm sorry. He might not have done this, but he did something. And so, his ass ought to be in jail anyway. That's how difficult is it going to be to reform police departments, the courts, and to equalize sentencing when the people who are meting out this justice have racial attitudes like this. I'll start with you, Mr. Williams.
I would say that, the earlier question really speaks to that. We have figured out ways to rationalize our country's bad behavior. By saying things like the system is broken, it allows judges and police officers and lay people to feel comfortable with this blatant racism that exists, to the tune that you can change the complexion of the judge, of the police officer, of the DA, and get the exact same racist result, get the exact same type of policing and prosecuting. The person who held this post before me, his social media was pretty much full of mugshots of individuals. And the lion's share of them were African-American. Needless to say, we removed those pages immediately, but we have to talk about reforming the media. We have to talk about reforming so many, schools. Ms. Lopez's comments about police in schools really speaks volumes to it. Very rarely do police stop a crime from occurring, right? Police are called after a crime has occurred. But having young people walk into schools with metal detectors and an armed person really says a lot about what we think about them, and that we believe that they are somehow more criminal than their white counterparts. Gregory Porter, one of my favorite jazz artists, he's about 6'4", used to play football, but he talks about how he would sing opera in an elevator if an older white woman got on that elevator to put her at ease, right? And that is really what is going on throughout this entire system. And so we have to be very specific about the verbiage we use, the language we use. I'm very conscious if I hear a prosecutor use words that dehumanizes a person who is charged with a crime, because we don't need to do that to prosecute. We also have to engage in implicit bias training to root out those things that folks probably don't feel are racist because they have a Black friend or a Jewish friend or a friend of or another minority. So we have to be very specific about how we're going to undo this work, right? The national average is roughly for accepting cases is roughly at about 60%. The DA who was here before me had a quota of accepting close to 90% of the cases that exist, when other parishes that are more rural, much more conservative, were only accepting 60, 65%. Well, my parish is predominantly African-American, right? And that same sort of percentage applies to how often the habitual offender law is used, right? So all of that really speaks to the criminalization of Blackness, right? And it has been, and I think the book Stamped from the Beginning does a really wonderful job of showing us every single phase and facet and evolution of this country, figuring out different ways to criminalize Blackness, from when an Irishman and an African tried to escape slavery together. They would penalize that Irishman more if he escaped with an African. And that has just been layered and layered in such a way that we sometimes don't even see it. So when Rick Jones says, if you walk into a courtroom, and that could be a municipal court, that could be traffic court, that could be magistrate misdemeanors, it's not just the big felonies, it's every facet of the criminal legal system. But you either walk into that courtroom and see all those Black men and women that are shackled and think something is wrong here, or you say something is wrong with these people. And I don't know what most people are actually seeing when they see that, because it is so pervasive.
Genia, can you talk about that as well from your perspective? I mean, you're actually representing the people who are on the short end of this kind of racial inequality. How do you deal with those attitudes?
When I think about this question, my it just kind of raises the hair on my skin. Like it is so just, it's so sad that we live in a reality in which there are statements like that you mentioned, that people would say that even if you're not convicted, that you still deserve the time that you got, pre-trial or whatever it was. I mean, I have a hard time even interacting with kind of that mode of thought, because it is just so far from what we should be up to as people in this society and how we caretake for one another. And I think about, I run an organization called SE Justice Group, which is a loving and powerful community of women with incarcerated loved ones. So mothers, sisters, wives, daughters, girlfriends, grandmothers of people behind bars. 1 in 4 women in the US, because of mass incarceration, has a family member in prison. For Black women, 1 in 2. And so this is a huge number of women who are not just directly impacted, but know up close and personal what the system looks like, what it's doing to families, what the ramifications and consequences are of our doubling down on this, kind of punishment path. And every year we, for the last 3 or 4 years, we have been bailing Black women out of jail before Mother's Day. We are founding members of the National Bailout Collective. And last year, we met a woman, a mother, inside of an LA County jail. And she was there when we met her for 14 months. She had been there for 14 months. She was denied access to medical care, had suffered a spinal cord injury that she was not getting treatment for. And the jail officials refused to take her to family court. And so as a result of having missed her court dates, her children were separated, not just from each other, but also she had lost her custody. All of that happened within the course of the 14 months and more, right? The consequences were traumatizing and devastating, not just for her, but for an entire family. We raised $200,000, another issue for another time to explain, the bail framework in this country is a mess, but we raised $200,000 to secure her freedom, to buy her freedom. When she was released, her case was dismissed. And the reality is that there are so many people who are inside of jails pre-trial who are just like her, who, but for not being able to have money to pay, are losing an incredible amount unnecessarily and suffering tremendous consequences. And so to the person who would say she somehow deserved, and her children somehow deserved what happened to her because even though she didn't get a conviction, that was something that it boggles the mind. And I think about this as also, as being incredibly important, how we frame this issue of, is it broken or is it working as it was designed, is not an academic question for me. It's a question that I encounter every day as we pursue policy reform in our work. When I serve as one of the co-chairs of the Movement for Black Lives policy table, and last summer when we were all just kind of awakened to the horrors of the violent policing in our communities with the loss and death and murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade and Ahmaud Arbery, what the response was that we saw from Congress was a response that operated from a central analysis that said this system is broken, right? And so what that looked like in terms of the policies that were promoted, that we saw inside of that bill, that we see inside of that bill, were what we would consider reformist, were things that were not going to transform or make this country safe for Black people. And instead were, things like, I remember the conversations we were all having about qualified immunity and no knock warrant bans and things like that. And I thought to myself, as a mother, as a daughter and a sister and, of Black people, I am invested in policy change that looks like ensuring that myself, my family members, and my children can live free from criminal legal system violence. Not that it will be easier for us in a court of law one day after the fact to receive damages and some type of compensatory relief, right? And yet what we seem to be talking about is qualified immunity over and over again. And I'm not saying that's not important. We want bans to qualified immunity. It's very important, and that is a win. But the problem is that the scope of the solutions that we're discussing are all within kind of a framework of all we need to do is kind of nibble at the edges and just set the train back on the track. It just kind of veered off of it. And that is a not a good use of our time and our resources. Lastly, I will just say, you asked, what do we need to do? We need movement. We need organizers. We need people pressure. It's not just going to take, good, well-intentioned work from inside out. It is going to require the connecting of communities and directly impacted people to lead this work for it to really be transformative.
Thank you. Rick Jones, how do you, when you're in a courtroom and you hear the prosecutor demonizing your client, what can you do? And I raise this, and if people don't understand what I'm talking about, let me just give an example. And one of the best examples was not a police officer, was not a police officer, but you've heard this in terms of police officers' defenses when they have been accused of wrongful use of force and whatnot. But when George Zimmerman killed Trayvon Martin, he was not a police officer, but he was a would-be vigilante. And he encountered Trayvon Martin. And in his defense, when he killed this young man, part of his defense was that I feared for my life, that I had to use this force because, and he builds up this Trayvon, who was half his weight. Trayvon was unarmed, he had the gun, and yet the jury bought it, that I feared for my life and I had to use this force because of like most Black guys, he was superhuman, he was on something. I mean, that's part of the dehumanization process that allows this to continue and allows police officers to be acquitted when they have clearly misused their power. Rick.
I think Gina sort of hit the nail on the head in many ways. I think that the time is long past for reform. I mean, I think we really are at a place now where we have to not only transform, but really work to dismantle the systemic and structural racism and mechanisms that foster and propagate and perpetuate the kinds of things that you're talking about. And so, in a way, I can't really be all that concerned about sort of white people's fears and sort of what sort of rationalizations are being used and how we sort of overcome implicit bias. I think all those things are important and necessary, but really and truly, I mean, I think the moral arc of the universe is long. I think it does bend towards justice, but for me anyway, the clock is ticking. And I think we really need to get about the business of long-term. We're in this sort of dynamic moment right now in this country, and I think Gina's right. I mean, 25 million or more people have gone into the streets. We really have to be sort of thinking about really sort of systemic and structural change, transformative change. And what that means for me, because I think that one of the voices that has sort of been unappreciated and unheard for so long, since Gideon and even before, is the voice of the public defender. And I think that when we started this conversation and we were talking about, Jason and representing sort of the system, I think that the system, there's three sort of independent aspects of our adversarial system. There's the judiciary, there's the prosecutor, and then there's the defense. And really 80% or more of all the people in this country who are represented by public defenders. And the public defender voice has really been unheard and unappreciated. And I think that one of the things that we talk about at NDS in my organization is the power of public defense. And really, if you have client-centered, community-based, holistic team defense in every sort of region of this country that is well-resourced and able to really combat the evils that we see in our system, you would, if we had been doing that from the very beginning, you would see less, mass incarceration and over criminalization and all the evils we have with pretrial detention and disparate sentencing in every sort of step of the way. I think if you really had a well-oiled and a well-resourced public defense system, you would begin to make those changes. But I also think at NDS, we're now thinking about next generation sort of thinking. And that's where the NDS PACE program came from, the Police Accountability and Community Empowerment, because I think that one of the things that public defenders, particularly at NDS, has learned from our sort of the relationships we have with our clients, sort of the front row view to the oppression and the disparate treatment, is that not only do we understand sort of how policing and how the racism in the system works, but we have the necessary skills to begin to dismantle it. We have the necessary skills to begin to change the way policing happens in this country. And so it's not only the things that Gina talked about and really understanding and how to go about dismantling policing and changing it, but it's also the community empowerment piece and really sort of going in and being an ally and being an asset to communities as they begin to heal and then learn how to sort of exercise that self-determination that we know that is required for them to be able to breathe. And so I think that in addition to the sort of understanding the policing aspect of it, we really have to be about the business of empowering our communities, of working in our communities and being an asset and an ally and helping people to understand community empowerment and to really sort of self-determine. I mean, people, when they call the police, they don't want badge and gun solutions. They want care and repair solutions. That's what they want. And they have to be able to sort of understand and determine how those resources are used in their communities and be able to speak to that from a perspective of strength and balance and not sort of be at the under the sort of boot or the knee of policing. And I think so. I think Gina's right. We really have to be about transformation, and we really have to be as much focused on community empowerment and self-determination as we are about the really transformative structural change that has to happen as well.
Christy Lopez, piggybacking on that, as someone who has been involved in investigating the abuses of police departments and looking at reform of police departments, how difficult is that, given these attitudes and many of the attitudes of people who run police departments?
Well, it's really, I mean, it's very difficult. But one of the things I learned over time, and I wrote about this in a piece I wrote for the Washington Post. One of the reasons it's so difficult is because it's not broken, because the police are doing exactly what we've asked them to. We've literally asked them to do an impossible job, right? And then we get mad at them for doing it, and in just the way we told them to. And guess what? There are racial disparities. There's unnecessary harm. There's unnecessary incarceration. And so I think I learned that you can and should reduce the harm that policing causes through those efforts. And I think that's really, really important as we do this deeper work. But we have to do the deeper work. But as we do that, we have to keep in mind what my co-panelists have been saying, that this is much bigger than just policing, right? If we're actually just policing and just sort of the blatant kinds of biases that you're example posited, it would actually be much easier than it actually is. You know, people like Dorothy Roberts talk about how we need to, you know, abolish child protective services, because that can be just as damaging because of the biases that invade not just policing, but all sorts of government structures, right? And those biases keep us from thinking about public safety the way we should, the way that Rick Jones is encouraging us to think about it. That, you know, as public safety should be about building up communities. We have these biases that think, no, that won't work. You know, those people over there won't respond to, you know, healthy, you know, clean air and, you know, drinking and good drinking water and healthy food and good housing. We think, you know, they need to be controlled, and they won't respond to things like my children would. And so I think we need to get out of that we need to shift that mindset. And if we do, and only then I think, will we begin to recognize that the way to achieve public safety is to build up communities and to shift resources. And when people are living with trauma, to address that trauma, not put them in jail or prison, right? But we're just not there yet because we don't think about public safety in that way. And these biases do keep us from really truly believing that other people will respond to help and to care in the way that we think we would respond to help and to care. So we've got to recognize that we have some really pernicious biases that are preventing us from seeing the solutions that will work.
And how do we, I mean, this question for any of you actually, how do we, and I think it's been touched on, there is another factor here, which I think on top of racial inequality, and that is economic inequality, that the criminal justice system seems to work best for you if you are well-heeled, if you have a lot of money. How do we level that playing field, or can we? Anybody?
But Mr. Monroe, doesn't that always, that takes us right back to the race conversation, back to the housing insecurity, financial insecurity, poor health outcomes. And James Baldwin, I think, said it best: people are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them. You know, if we talk about the Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman, stand your ground, one of those people did not have a right to stand their ground because America did not see that as their ground, right? So undoing this, I think, really requires us to think radically in all these spaces: criminal justice, housing, banking, because there's so many things that feed into the particular narrative, and even some of the compliments that are passed from time to time. People talk about Black folks as having superhuman strength, or being able to take more punishment. That's not a compliment. I don't want to be thought of as someone that can take a beating, or someone who is resilient. That resilience, as it's often used, is used to make Black folks subhuman, and to say they can take on more pressure, they can take on more unfairness and do okay with it. So I think we really have to be radical in terms of our reform, think beyond a 4-year or 6-year term, to make real institutional change that challenges all of our systems. Because if we were to just address these things in the criminal legal system, our banking laws, our school systems, all of this is going to play into it in a way that predetermines what happens that first day in court.
Anybody?
And I don't want people to walk away from this sort of feeling overwhelmed, and as though there's, you know, this is more than anybody can necessarily, you know, think, you know, get their minds around or their arms around the problem, because I, you know, while I do think that, you know, at NDS we talk about it sort of from the womb to the tomb, when you're talking about all of the sort of, you know, things that happen from, you know, differences in prenatal health care, through, you know, food deserts, through housing insecurity, through you know, and you can go on and on and on, you know, inability to gain access to education, or being, you know, the being behind in terms of, you know, almost out of the gate, being behind in terms of educational opportunities and employment and transportation, and all of those things can leave you sort of feeling overwhelmed. But I really want people to know that you know, and I guess we'll get to a call to action at some point. But really, you know, there is a roadmap and there is a way, and it does have to do with understanding, really being in a position of understanding the systems and the structures that oppress, and understanding how to dismantle them, because that is possible and that is doable. But it's also about community empowerment and understanding how to uplift and empower the community. And so I think that it's sort of an arm in arm undertaking. But I don't want people to feel as though you know, we can't make change and we can't move forward in a positive way, because I think that we can. And I think that all the folks in their own sort of particular ways on this panel and on the Zoom call are really doing that. And so I want people to feel as though there is a roadmap and there is a way for us to really get to the place where, I mean, because look, the truth of the matter is, and I probably am up against the clock. The truth of the matter is, if you are rich and white, there almost is no criminal legal system, right? You don't experience it, you don't feel it, you don't think about it, it doesn't really exist. And if you somehow contort yourself to get caught up in it, then you are generally able to get out of it as well, unscathed, without the collateral consequences and without all the other things that happen to folks who are not rich and white and get caught up in the system. So you know, I you know, there is a way to think about this that you know, uplifts and empowers and really begins to move the needle in terms of the moral arc and making sure that Black and brown folks have a real claim and a real stake and a real opportunity at all of the, you know, blessings of liberty, if you will, that everyone else in society gets. And I think that I want people to walk away from this conversation empowered, engaged, and motivated to do and to join the struggle.
Which brings me, I think, to the point where we should move now to some calls to action. I think people want answers. I think people, not just, you know, who are dialing into this forum, but they want to know what can they do to change the system, to improve the system, to be a part of the solution. So why don't each of us, each of you, and we'll start with Gina, talk about, you know, what can ordinary people do, you know, to help solve this problem. And I'd like to hear that from each of you, but Gina.
Well, so I have some very concrete things, but I also want to just say that I'm so happy that, you know, Rick left us with the mandate to be optimistic, because I think it is 100% accurate. I would not be doing this if I didn't feel like there was hope. And in fact, I think all we need to do is look back to 7 years ago since Ferguson, when Mike Brown was murdered, to understand that things have changed dramatically in our movement, and the pressure, the demands, all of that has shifted. Right back then, what we were hearing kind of from the streets and from in the public discourse was, how do we hold individual officers accountable? Right. That is absolutely still the demand. We still want to, you know, prosecute murderous police. Right. That is still absolutely something that's important to the movement. But what we have seen happen and dramatically change in this past year was that all of a sudden the demands were about, let's look and re-examine our budgets. Let's understand more systemically how we have gotten here. How have we funded our way into this reality? And let's understand our budgets to be moral documents. And I think that that is actually an incredibly, and despite the fact that, you know, every pace forward is going to be, you know, mired in debate and all of that is real, and struggle is part of the struggle, right? But what I want to say is that that is a demarcation of progress, of a systemic change focus. And so what the ask is related to that, and that is to support the Breathe Act. The Breathe Act is a Movement for Black Lives bill, a federal bill. It is the largest piece of federal legislation ever to be presented to Congress by any social movement in history. It is something that I was honored to architect and bring to our policy table, and have since, we have about 165,000 community co-sponsors that we generated in a couple of months when we unveiled it last year. And we need your help to really push. The first section absolutely is about contracting our systems of harm by removing funding vehicles, right, that have helped perpetuate this harm in this infrastructure. But over 90% of what the Breathe Act does is actually make investments in areas like housing, economic justice, environmental justice, and so forth. And so health. So we are really taking the approach that safety is achieved through investing in the social determinants of health and safety, not in punitivity and punishment and carcerality. So please support the Breathe Act and support organizations within our movement for Black lives.
Mr. Williams?
I'd say, and I certainly agree with Mr. Jones and Ms. Clayton Johnson about how tax dollars are spent. I think that's critically important. I used to be on the city council here in New Orleans before I became DA. And one of my last official acts as president of city council was to pass a budget that cut funding for the DA's office in an effort to achieve parity with the public defender's office. Because it has never been a fair fight here in the city of New Orleans. The criminal legal system, regardless of where you live, is the only line item in municipal budgets that gets funded more and grows every year, regardless of its outcomes, regardless of its success metrics. And so I would ask everyone, wherever you are, to evaluate that budget and ask yourself, what if we took some of this and put it in early childhood education? What if we put some of this into mental health interventions? It would reduce crime, but it would also reduce victims, the number of victims in any given town. The other thing I'd ask you to do is have conversations with your families and your friends and talk about voting rights. Not just voting rights like the conversation that we see happening in Georgia, but let's start talking about why when someone gets convicted of a felony, they lose their right to vote, right? Ms. Clayton Johnson brought up Nixon's chief of staff and made it very, very clear that the war on drugs was to marginalize folks who would not have voted for Richard Milhouse Nixon. If the state of Louisiana reinstated voting rights for felons, we could turn Louisiana blue in one single year. So there are a number of angles that we can approach this conversation from, depending upon your walk of life. But I really encourage people to have those tough conversations with people, as you described. I think, I don't know if it's Mr. Monroe or Mr. Jones. A lot of folks don't see their part, or they don't see themselves in the space. If you're paying taxes, we're all in the space. If you're living in a community that is treating people unfairly, you're in the space and you're part of it. So that would be my call to action.
Christy Lopez, your call to action.
That's interesting. Many of us are talking about budgets and building things up, and that is in part my call to action as well. I think given that so many others have spoken of that, I'll add sort of a piece that goes directly to what I know most about, which is policing. I do think that we're going to need to shift not just our mindset, but also resources to these other, government and non-governmental entities and individuals who can build up communities. And that's, once we get that mind shift and think about public safety more broadly, we will see that that's how we get better public safety, as well as just independently allow communities to thrive more. So the one piece I will add to that is that when we do that, we need to recognize that investment is going to require far more than you could ever get from your law enforcement anyway. We just need to invest more in that. But I think we can have smaller police departments and be not only as safe, but safer. But we can't, in my view, we can't just say, cut 25% this year, 50% next year, and then, we'll just go until it's done. I think we need to be really thoughtful. And so this is what I challenge people to do, is to once more be optimistic and engage and take the time to figure out with your communities, get that organizing happening. What do we actually want our police agents to do, our first responders to do, versus what should somebody else be doing? What should mental health responders be doing? What should we, allow people who work with unsheltered people to be doing? And then really learn to be sophisticated about what you actually need your police department to do and how to get them to do that and what they need to do that function. And I think most of us will find we want some first responders, whatever we call them, doing something, right? But we need to really be thoughtful about what that exact thing is, and fund it accordingly. And I think that's something that I'm starting to see many communities do in a very real way in the past year. But I still see a lack of we just haven't had time to really do the work to really figure out what we really want, what's left over that we really actually need police to do. And I think if we do that, we show that level of thoughtfulness, there'll be more support for moving the rest of it to entities and both governmental and non-governmental that will keep us safer.
Rick Jones, your call to action.
First of all, I appreciate DA Williams talking about the public defender office and a fair fight. I think that's right. I think that if we had client-centered, community-based, holistic team defense in every jurisdiction of this country that was well-resourced, you would see almost immediately a change in our criminal legal system. It would be mind-boggling if we really understood the power of public defense and invested in it. So that's the first thing. But I also think that I have to sort of echo what everyone else has said. And obviously, it's true. Follow the money, pay attention to the money. And so I would encourage two things, really. And there was a time, I have to tell you, there was a time when the annual expenditure for bullets for the New York City Police Department was bigger than the annual budget, the overall entire budget for my office. They spent more on bullets for police than they did for money in my office. So what I would encourage people to do is to first understand your police budget, where you live, and look at how tax dollars are spent on policing, and then compare that with what's being spent on mental health and housing and healthcare and education in your communities, and look at the imbalances there when you look at law enforcement versus those other areas. And then I would ask you to drill down even deeper and look at what your local school district is spending on policing in your schools versus things like textbooks and laptops and art programs or art classes or music in the school, and look at the imbalances. And really what I really want you to do is look at your community and see what those expenditures are on police versus textbooks and educational things. But then don't just look at your community, look at what those things are in Detroit. Look at what they are in Jackson. Look at what they are in the Antelope Valley, in California, in Lancaster and Palmdale, and understand what the expenditures are for policing in schools versus for education and culturals and laptops and books. And you will really, and I think that will really not only shock some folks, shock the conscience, but it will also, I think, be a real motivator and a real call to action. So I'd ask you to do that homework and really sort of dig in to how much money is being spent on policing in schools versus textbooks and laptops and music programs and art programs and things like that. And I think it can't help but anger you and then spur you to action.
Great suggestions, everybody. I would just like to add to those that I think one of the things that people can do, especially people who are finding this information surprising or who had no idea that the criminal justice system was imbalanced, is as we deal with all questions, many of the questions that we're dealing with, race and policing and whatnot, learn as much as you can about Black and brown and people and other non-white peoples. Learn some of their history. Learn why why they're impacted in the way they are. Learn why they act, why Black men, Black people react to police authority the way they do. There's a history to it. Black people aren't just anti-police because they're anti-police. In fact, let me correct myself, right? Black people are not anti-police. They are anti-people, anti-corrupt police, anti-police abusing their authority. Black people have respect for the police when the police respect them. So learn more, learn about Black people, learn about brown people. And then with that newfound information, use it to bring pressure, as the panelists have said, on elected officials who are in the criminal justice system. We have one more call to action, a special one from Steve Milliken, who represents an organization called Justice Aid. Steve?
Thank you, Sylvester, and thanks to the panel. Justice Aid is honored to be able to pair and partner with ClassACT. And for those of you who know Justice Aid, you know that we pick a burning issue, and then we try to identify the most extraordinary activists who are addressing that issue. And we try to leverage the power of the arts to raise money to support great works. And in this case, we are incredibly proud to be partnering with NDS as it launches its PACE program, Police Accountability, Community Empowerment. And they're based on their brilliant model of holistic defense services in Harlem. They've carried that to Detroit, and they want to launch the PACE program across the country in Jackson, Mississippi, Los Angeles, California, Dallas, Fort Worth, and on and on. And we have the power to help them seed that work. The Justice Aid Board has raised $200,000 in a challenge, and we hope all of you, and this is my call to action, will dig deep and help us match that $200,000 so we can give a check to the PACE program to launch and to carry its work across the country. My call to action is blunt, and it's simply that it takes money to do these things, and I'm asking you to dig deep to support this initiative. Every single dollar you give to Justice Aid through justiceaid.org is going to be matched up to $200,000 for a total of $400,000 that we would like to raise as a result of our work here tonight. And we'll deliver dollar for dollar to the PACE program. None of that money is going to support Justice Aid. We raise that on the side. This is all about the action of, putting our money where this conversation leads us. And we're going to have another conversation at Riverside Church about similar topics. And we're really fortunate to have Sherilyn Eiffel to be the keynote speaker who will address the history of racism and policing. And then we're going to have a concert and Robert Glasper and Terrace Martin will be performing. This is May 25th. Our Riverside Church event is May 2nd. May 25th, we're going to have a concert to try and raise even more money for the PACE program. So again, my call to action, let's put the money where our talk is. Thank you very much.
Yeah. I think now we've had, it's been wonderful discussion to this point, and we have some wonderful questions that are coming in from our audience and participation. And I think we should try and answer as many of these as we can.
Sylvester, can I just take 30 seconds?
Yeah, sure, absolutely, absolutely.
And just express on behalf of myself, obviously, but NDS more importantly, our thanks to Steve and to Justice Aid, to the ClassACT of '73, and to you, Sylvester, and to all of our panelists today too for this incredible discussion. I learned a lot, but really we are humbled and honored and really appreciative of the opportunity to work with Justice Aid and to have this opportunity to participate in this forum with ClassACT. Of course, we're looking forward to the Riverside Forum as well. But I just want to say thank you and really express our deep and sincere appreciation to everyone who's participated in this, in making this evening come together for NDS PACE.
Thank you very much. A question from Jeff Ashford, a member of our audience. He asks, the Biden administration has inherited the Trump bar legacy of capital punishment. What are the prospects for abolishing it, in particular for its racist application? Anybody?
I've got some friends that are working with the president and the vice president, and I think it's on their list. They're absolutely having conversations about it. I think there's also some conversations about decriminalization of marijuana as well. I think it's an excellent time for us to start pushing our state legislators to start having some real conversations about it. I was at the LDAA, which is the Louisiana District Attorneys Association, and I'm pretty much the black sheep. Maybe I'm called the African-American sheep of that organization in my state. And I brought up legalization and I brought up abolishment of the death penalty. And surprisingly, these veteran prosecutors were like, we're okay with it. They were shockingly on board. Some of them for fiscal reasons, some of them for moral reasons, but they were shockingly on board with both. And so I really think that the more push we do on the state level, I think it supports Congress and the White House to move more aggressively.
Anybody else want to speak to that question?
I mean, I found in doing the advocacy work that while the moral issue is frequently, the one where it sort of is more righteous and you can be more passionate, you get more ground, particularly in a bipartisan way, when you can make the economic case. And so I think that to the extent that folks have been really sort of sophisticated about making the economic case when it comes to legalization, when it comes to solitary confinement, when it comes to the death penalty, and other issues like that, I think we're more likely to make progress. So again, just in terms of a call to action, I can't really sort of I don't have a crystal ball. I can't tell you what is going to come out of the Biden administration, but I do think that another call to action would really be to call your elected officials, write letters to them, make your voices heard, and also as you dig into the budgets, make the economic case for why we need to end the death penalty, capital punishment in this country. It's not a deterrent to anything. It's racistly applied, and it's expensive.
Another very good question from the audience is we've talked a lot about the abuses of the system, excesses of the system, but one of the things we haven't talked about is could you all speak to the neglect of policing in poor communities? I mean, support, serving and protecting. And we've all talked about how, police departments don't really serve and protect Black communities. They're actually trying to protect. But could we speak about how we get police departments to actually serve and protect and provide police adequate policing in poor communities?
I'm sure Rick could really talk about this a lot, but there's a really wonderful book called Gettocide. And I can tell you that in my jurisdiction, we have a lot of retaliatory homicides and shootings. And the South is notorious for taking justice into its own hands in certain communities because law enforcement has fallen down on the job, right? Most of the shootings that occur in the city of New Orleans, it involves some cousin trying to pay back someone else's cousin for some crime that occurred back in 1980, right? So cold cases, unsolved homicides, and in the conversation about what a victim is and what a defendant is. In my town, a person that is a defendant in January is a victim in July, right? So there's a lot of overlap, which is why we really need so much trust in all communities, especially those that are impoverished.
I would just,
Go ahead.
I would just add that, I think that what I I'm interested in kind of what the line of thinking that Christy shared with us earlier around what is it that others are actually better positioned to be doing than police officers to serve and to protect. And I think that what we at least see, you know, in Los Angeles, I live in a county where since 2000, our sheriff's department has taken the life of over 900 people. We actually have on the record police gangs that you only get in if you do serious bodily harm or kill a person in LA, and it is a Black or brown person who lives in South LA, right? And so there is a relationship, a long-standing relationship that has existed between police and communities of color where I live that does not feel like service and protection, but feels like terror. And I believe that the way that we can start to think more expansively about other, you know, public health officials and first responders that are non-punitive and non-violent, and all the other kinds of resources that we have at our disposal to serve and to protect that are not police is actually a very productive line of conversation that we need to be seriously having at a policy level.
Another good question from one of our classmates, Peter Madreas. Do you feel, given his history as the chair of the Judiciary Committee, Crime and Prison Bills, that President Biden is an ally for reform, or is he an incrementalist? That's a toughie, but.
I mean,
Anybody?
it's not hard. It's not hard for me.
Oh, okay.
Maybe I'm just not ready to go there. But we have in office a person who is instrumental in passing the '94 crime bill, right? Like, this is a person who who is saying we need to give $300 million more to policing in this country. And that was recent. That was in 1994, right? So I think that what we have is work to do with this administration. Where my hope comes from is the fact that there are some appointments and people who, you know, we have been working with on the Hill, and others who are really well positioned to be able to open up dialogue in the direction of progress that I'm excited about. But I'm not shy about saying that you know, President Biden has made his record pretty clear on where he stands in terms of the level that he, at least historically, has been willing to go on this issue, and even now. And I think that just requires that we push and we show up as a movement to really require that our elected officials deliver on kind of effective results in the area of race equity in our criminal legal system.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have too much more to say about that, other than, also you sort of look at our vice president as a career law enforcement person, before she got into politics. And that sort of gives you a little bit of a sense as well. We really just need to really sort of fundamentally change, as Gina was saying, change the narrative. And also, change the mechanics, change the structure of the system. I've been sort of drawn into conversations with people about the idea of a defender general, a public defender general, and how that would look and what it would mean, and how it would sort of be impactful or influential, and where should it be in government, and should it be a cabinet position, sort of with the attorney general, but always the conversation comes back to the fact, well, anybody who you would want for that job could never get through a confirmation hearing, could never get enough support to be confirmed. And so I think that really sort of speaks to, what we need to be doing to really sort of fundamentally change the way things operate in this country, is that we have to change, the players, as well as the structure in the system, in order to get to the places where I think Professor Lopez and Gina have been talking about, and DA Williams.
So last question here before I turn it back over to Marion. And this is a question from the audience. I think a very good question. So tens of millions of people voted for Donald Trump. They probably aren't interested in changing the system. How do we deal with them? How do we deal with that? Anyone?
I mean, you know, again, you know, it's changing the rules, it's changing the structures. You know, we've gerrymandered this country into a place where you can lose an election by 3 million votes and still win the election. You know, I mean, look, there is, you know, this country is sick with racism. This country is infected with racism. This country has, you know, a bad case of the virus of racism. And so I think that there is always going to be, you know, at least for the foreseeable future, a sort of a split and based along sort of a racist lens. But I do think that, you know, again, the moral arc is long, and I think it is bending towards justice. And I do think that there are more people who want to see equity and fairness and lack of disparity and a more perfect union. But I think that we have to, you know, get to the place where those voices are able to be heard. And it can't be that, you know, you get 3,000 more popular votes and you lose the election. We just have to sort of begin to change fundamentally, and we're in a dynamic moment, fundamentally change the way, you know, from policing on up, this country operates.
We have to call the thing though. You know, we can't allow people who want to hate to feel comfortable, right? Whether it's a synagogue, whether it's a spa, whether it's a Baptist church, and you know, and I think that shifts to prosecutors, right? The law enforcement folks in Atlanta are coming up with the mental health issues of the most recent mass shooter, right? No one talks about mental health issues when someone robs a liquor store. But anytime that you start seeing hate crimes, after they take the person through the drive-through to get him something to eat, they start talking about his mental health capacity. So we need to make sure that we recognize that domestic terrorism in the United States is profoundly more prevalent and more of a threat than any international terror that we have ever faced. And there are a lot of people who I don't think are really ready to wrap their arms around that simple fact. From the Klan to Dylan Roof.
Well, I think we're about out of time. Let me give a hearty thanks to this stellar panel. District Attorney Jason Williams, Rick Jones, Gina Clayton Johnson, and Christy Lopez. Thank you so much. You guys have been absolutely wonderful. And now, Marion, back to you.
And Sylvester, so have you. Thank you very much for leading an extraordinary conversation. And I also thank you, Christy, Gina, Jason, and Sylvester, Rick and Sylvester, for this amazing hour and a half. Please do, all of you who are here listening and watching, pay attention to these calls to action and think how you can impact them and work on them. I also want to thank Steve Milliken and Justice Aid and its grantee partner NDS PACE program. And we are so pleased to be partnering with Justice Aid in trying to promote the work that NDS PACE is doing. Thanks go to our production and program teams for this evening: Sarah Greenberg, Therese Steiner, Donna Brown-Guillaume, Steve Milliken, Rick Weil, Jackie Swearingen, Rick Brotman, Katie Marinello, and Diana Lavanchu. And again, thank you from the bottom of our hearts to Sylvester and our extraordinary panelists. Good evening.